Welcome. Welcome. I don't normally speak from prepared notes, but I'm going to do that today to make sure I don't forget all the things I wanted to mention. But welcome on behalf of Chapel Hill Public Library. I am Molly Luby. I am the Community History Coordinator here at the library. And just before we get started, I think probably everybody in here knows we have restrooms in the lobby. They're in the lobby. You all know you're in a public program, so your the ringers are off. But you're double checking right now. Great. We do have a couple of other library staff that I want to shout out. So Derek is right here in the back, our community history assistant. Derek will be taking photographs, as will Luis, who is right over here. So if you need anything also, they can help you. And before you go, we do have some evaluation forms that I would love for you to fill out. Not required, they're totally anonymous. They help us plan programs in the future. So if you have a moment before you go, fill those out and drop them in the bucket. And that's that business. But tonight, you are here for a public program. And I'm really happy that this is a public program that we are doing in partnership with Carolina Public Humanities, one of our favorite partners. And Carolina Public Humanities has brought together this amazing panel full of some of my very favorite people. So I'm really excited about it. Quote, "Problems in life are inevitable. We know from history that other human beings have struggled with issues that are similar to ours. Whether it's the loss of a job, feelings of disenfranchisement, political polarization, warfare, economic depression, or any other crisis, if we understand how the issues we face have also been addressed by generations of people around the world, we have a way to make sense of what's going on today." That sounds pretty smart, right? Well, that's because Lloyd Kramer said it. Word has it that Dr. Kramer will be stepping down from his role as Director of Carolina Public Humanities at the end of the month and entering the wonderful world of retirement. So on behalf of the library, I want to thank you for your tireless work in bringing public humanities programming out into the community for so many years. And I'm going to turn the mic over to him. We have a little gift of appreciation from the library. That's for you before you go.
Oh. Thank you, Molly. What a pleasure and a privilege it is to collaborate with the Chapel Hill Public Library. Yes, I'm Lloyd Kramer, and I've been a professor at UNC for over 30 years, and it's been my privilege to work with a number of the people, all the people on this stage. It's a wonderful group. For those of you who are not familiar with Carolina Public Humanities, we have a little brochure here that tells about our programs. We are the bridge between the university and the whole state, public education, community colleges, libraries, and our goal, Molly just quoted me, I'm just almost moved to tears to hear my own words thrown back at me. The word is the humanities and history, literature, they help us make sense of the world in which we live, and they are empowering because they give us a way to respond to the problems in our own world. Before I introduce Alex Odom here, I want to mention one other event. It's a very important event coming up. This is the symposium on the 60th anniversary of the signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. We're talking about the Voting Rights Act tonight. Have you all heard about this program? It's a very important program. It's going to be here on July 2nd. I won't go over all the panelists, although there are some familiar faces on the on the program. Mr. James Williams, I believe, is in the back. He's helping to organize. He's the organizer. 8:45 to 3:45 p.m. on Tuesday, July 2nd. So check this out. It'll be terrific. Okay. We're fortunate to have such good partners here at the library. So now to launch this conversation about the Voting Rights Act, I'm going to introduce Alex Odom, who's here, Alexandra Odom. She is just finishing her PhD in the history department at UNC. This week, she took up a new position as the African-American Studies librarian at UNC, a position that has been woefully unfilled She's going to be helping people in the whole community understand African-American history. She was also an Adams Fellow of Carolina Public Humanities, Maynard Adams Fellow. These are people who work toward public-facing activities supported by Carolina Public Humanities. This is the humanities in action right now. And I should say also that she is committed to public-facing activities, and Alex will now lead the program from this point going forward. Alex Odom.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Thank you, Lloyd, for that introduction. He is always so complimentary when he gives bios, so we greatly appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panel to you all, and I can tell you from what I know about the three people joining me on stage, you all are definitely in for a treat. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. I'm going to start with Dr. Reginald Hildebrand. Dr. Hildebrand has served as an associate professor of African and Afro-American studies at UNC Chapel Hill. He is a member of St. Paul AME Church, and he is a former member of the Marion Cheek Jackson Center for Saving and Making History, the advisory board there. He also served on the board of directors for Freedom Park. When he walked in, we were just talking about Freedom Park over in Raleigh and how it was 20 years in the making, and the final product is absolutely stunning. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, I highly, highly encourage all of you all to take a look. It is so moving. So thank you so much for the work that you've done with that. Christopher Clark is in the Department of Undergraduate Studies and is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology, Political Science. I'm so sorry. He earned his BA from St. Louis University, his MA and PhD from the University of Iowa. He is interested in racial and ethnic politics in the United States with a particular emphasis on the minority representation. His current work examines women of color political elites, both in Congress and state legislatures. He is also interested in political behavior and public opinion. Thank you so much for joining us. Nadina Mason-Hogans is an oral historian, memory worker, and native of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, from a family of 7 generations of movement people. He uses oral histories to advocate for policy change and works at Duke University in partnership with veterans of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, and today's activist to center equity when documenting national and local movement history. Her TED Talk provides an explanation of the critical oral history methodology, which she helped to adapt. Anita helped to establish the first Chapel Hill Civil Rights Task Force, a podcast series on Chapel Hill history, the Chapel Hill 9 movement, James Cates Memorial, 4 documentaries about women in the local movement, and provided historical context for the newly established Braxton Fushi Day for the town of Carborough. Her recent projects include her service in the UNC History and Way Forward Task Force, a community-wide reparations book club discussion with Dr. Simona Golden, and authors Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen. Work with the UNC School of Medicine, the James Cates Scholars Young History Collective, and a documentary with Al Roker and John Deere entitled Gaining Ground, The Fight for Black Land. She's also worked on reimagining Peace and Justice Plaza in Chapel Hill, and her current avocation is for a no-cost education program and cost-free college tuition for the descendants of the enslaved laborers of UNC. Danita is always one of my favorite people to introduce. She's one of my favorite people to work with at Chapel Hill, so we all are definitely in for a treat. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to move in the direction that we are seated. So Dr. Hildebrand, we're going to go ahead and start off with some historical context.
Thank you. I am a big fan of Danita and her work, and pleased to be here. Lloyd, we are here largely and because of our respect for you and what you have done for the humanities and what you represent for the humanities. We've worked together for a very long time. I am by far the senior member of this panel, so I'm going to have to read my comments to you. I am providing some historical background for the comments that my colleagues will be making. Father Theodore Hesburgh, who served as chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, once said that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was, and I quote, the most successful civil rights law in the nation's history. But back when the act was still being debated in Congress, the New York Times reported this. For more than 3 hours, Senator Sam J. Ervin of North Carolina maintained that the new voting rights bill was unconstitutional. Mr. Irvin, a former Associate Justice of the State Supreme Court, argued that the bill was unconstitutional because it was an ex post facto law that created a presumption of rascality on the part of registrars. When the final vote was taken in Congress, both of North Carolina's senators voted against the measure, as did all of the 11 members of its House delegation, 9 Democrats and 2 Republicans. North Carolina's representatives were united in their opposition to the Voting Rights Act. There actually had been more support for Black voting in North Carolina in the 1830s. Of course, the free Black population then was small, but they did have the right to vote until 1835. And many members of the state legislature then opposed taking that right away. It should be noted that during the decades before the Civil War, Black people were not permitted to vote in most of the northern states either. The War to Save the Union also brought an end to slavery, and with it the hope for the rights and protections of citizenship, including the right to vote. The Reverend James Walker Hood was elected president of the Colored People's Convention that met in Raleigh in September of 1865, and was a delegate to the State Constitutional Convention in 1868. Reverend Hood was an outspoken, steadfast, and courageous advocate of the right to vote. During the Constitutional Convention, he declared, "You might as well talk of the safety of a flock of sheep with a pack of hungry wolves as to take the ballot from the colored man. We expect to maintain the right of suffrage at whatever cost, and this might as well be understood now as hereafter." In order to be readmitted to the Union, the federal government required that former states of the Confederacy enact new state constitutions that gave Black men the right to vote. But as Reverend Hood understood very well, the cost of voting and participating in the political process could be very high. I quote now from a recent book written by Paul M. Green, in which he describes a Black man who dared to register voters in Caswell County during those tumultuous years. Green wrote, he was a 65-year-old blacksmith and a former slave named Pharaoh Glass. He was a member of the Baptist Church, could read and write, and was respected in his neighborhood by both Black and white. Pharaoh Glass was a historic first and a striking anomaly, a gray-haired, bespectacled Black man serving as a registrar. He only served for a few months. Historian Green explained, Pharaoh Glass disappeared. On the morning of December 3rd, 1867, his overcoat, hat, and spectacles were found laid neatly on the ground by a pond on the property of his former master. A search below the surface of the cold water found his body anchored to the mud with a 25-pound rock attached to his neck. The Greensboro newspaper reported, Pharaoh Glass, an aged Negro of Caswell County, recently committed suicide by drowning himself. Pharaoh always sustained the character of a very worthy, industrious darky, until in an unlucky moment, he was appointed to the Board of Registrars. Another paper editorialized, we hope the colored people will take warning from the example of Pharaoh. The ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870 made it unconstitutional to deny the right to vote because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Senator Ervin must have known that. But there were ways to subvert and work around that amendment and make it meaningless. They were stark and brutal ways to discourage Black voting. In 1898, an 18-year-old young man named Manly Macaulay was lynched just outside Chapel Hill. As it happened, the lynching took place about a week before the election in November that year. The tragic and horrific circumstances of his murder are beyond the purview of this panel. What is relevant here is that his body was left hanging from a dogwood tree until after the election. His decomposing body served as a symbol and a warning. The blatant advice in a Chapel Hill newspaper had been clear. Let every Democrat go to the polls on the 8th of November and vote for white supremacy. And that is exactly what they did. It was just 2 days after that election that the duly elected biracial city government of Wilmington was violently overthrown by an overtly white supremacist mob. And it was about 2 years after that that North Carolina added to its state constitution an amendment that required voters to pay a poll tax and also pass a literacy test to the satisfaction of a white registrar. But that latter requirement did not apply to persons who had been eligible to vote on January 1, 1867, or who were the lineal descendants of such persons. And of course, no Black person had been eligible to vote on that date. The state was simply circumventing the 15th Amendment by finding a way to deny Black people the right to vote without explicitly citing race as the reason. So those are a few glimpses of the shameful, bloody, racist history that made the Voting Rights Act of 1965 necessary. We are familiar with the iconic voting rights campaign in Selma, Alabama, including Bloody Sunday, when state troopers beat marchers who crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and later, the successful march from Selma to Montgomery. The Voting Rights Act was passed, at least in part, because of the power of the voting rights movement in Selma. The initial idea for that campaign was developed right here in North Carolina by two extraordinary young activists from out of state, Diane Nash and James Bevel. The couple was in Edenton, working with North Carolina civil rights champion Golden A. Franks when they heard about the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, resulting in the deaths of 4 girls who were attending Sunday school. Diane Nash explained, James Bevel, my then husband, and I believed that a man and a woman would not allow those 4 little girls to be murdered and do nothing. On that fateful Sunday, in Edenton, North Carolina, in Golden and Mrs. Frank's living room, James Bevel and I conceptualized and wrote the plan that became the Selma Right to Vote movement. Bevel and I resolved that no matter how long it would take, we would get the right to vote. Eventually, their plan became the basis for the Selma movement, and the home of Golden A. Franks in Edenton is now preserved as a state historic site. One last story about a grand lady named Amelia Boynton. She was a mover and shaker in the Black community of Selma and was a major force organizing the Selma campaign. He was described by one veteran activist in this way. Mrs. Boynton stood tall, with a perpetual smile, yet a manner of quiet defiance, She had a long arm reach into the community. Her courage was incomparable. She stood face to face and toe to toe with Sheriff Jim Clark many times. Mrs. Boynton was an independent thinker and an eternal optimist. When others didn't dare to hope, she had hope. When we experienced setbacks, she saw progress and movement toward our goal, recognizing that setbacks were preludes to comebacks. During the Bloody Sunday March, Mrs. Boynton was beaten and tear-gassed until she was unconscious. On the 50th anniversary of that day, a grand commemorative march was held, and of course, she participated, but this time, she was pushed along in a wheelchair while her hand was held by President Barack Obama, the president who could not have become president were it not for her courage, fortitude, and determination 50 years earlier. She died a few months later that year at the age of 110. I didn't know Amelia Boynton, but I did know Rebecca Clark, who was a similar force in this community. She voted, but she did not simply vote for whatever or whoever the system offered and then hope for the best. She organized voters, vetted and recruited candidates. She got people elected and then held them accountable. I heard more than one politician confess how they dreaded getting a call from Ms. Clark because they knew it meant that they had done something that they shouldn't or not done something that they should have. And in either case, the only acceptable response was to say, "Yes, ma'am, Ms. Clark, I'll get right on it and do just what you said." Voting is essential, but votes alone are not enough. The political system has many good people working hard within it, accomplishing much. But the system is not self-correcting. It bends toward power and money, and issues are easily distorted, sensationalized, and trivialized. It requires constant vigilance, intervention, and reform. It requires many people, like Amelia Boynton and Rebecca Clark, in every generation, influencing every level of government. It requires keeping in our consciousness the history of Pharaoh Glass and James Walker Hood and Manly Macaulay and others whose names are far better known. That history calls us to order whenever the extreme, bizarre, frightening, and incomprehensible nuttiness of this election year tempts us to despair or inaction. That history also provides a starting point, a context, and perspective for the thoughtful assessment of the legacy of the Voting Rights Act that my distinguished colleagues will now provide.
Wow. Thank you for that. That's so powerful. I'll let that soak in a little bit. Those stories were, oh my gosh, really something. So I didn't prepare a lot of notes, but those of you who know me, you learn pretty quickly. That won't stop me from talking. I've kind of sketched through what I want to say. I'm a political scientist by training, and a lot of the work that I do is more quantitative in nature, although I'm increasingly doing more like interviews and looking in archival work and things like that. So what I'm going to do is I want to make 2 points, and I'm going to talk at length about the South and how the South became more Republican. And I'm actually going to talk in detail about a book that I highly recommend. I probably should have brought you my copy so you can see how closely I've read it with all my Post-it notes and so forth. But I think it provides a really compelling explanation for the shift in the South from being a solidly Democratic region to one where Republicans dominate. So the book that I'm going to talk some about is called The Rational Southerner. It's by Hood, Pitt, and Morris. It was published in 2012 by Oxford University Press. And I actually just taught this book in Maymester. I taught. So like not too long ago, I taught this book. So it's fresh in my mind. And so let me just talk a little bit about the argument, and then I'll offer a couple other thoughts out there or arguments out there about why the South went from being solidly Democratic to solidly Republican. Okay. So there are two parts to the book, and so they have this argument called relative advantage theory, RAT, and so there are two parts to this argument. Okay, one is control, and one is viability. And by the way, when I get excited, I talk really quickly, so I'm deliberately trying to not talk quickly here. So just in case y'all are trying to figure out my paces, I get excited, and then I lose people. I don't want to do that. So control. Okay, so the idea here is you had the 1965 Voting Rights Act, okay, and what that did is it brought thousands upon thousands of Black people into the political process. There was this massive increase in voter registration among Black people. So some of what was Dr. Hildebrand talked about, there were many barriers in place. And we think of literacy tests as being one, but there were many ways in which Blacks were blocked access to voting, okay? And so with the VRA, you had this big influx. And if we take a step back and just talk briefly about the 1964 presidential election between LBJ and Barry Goldwater, there's a lot we could say about that election, okay? But the thing I want to highlight is that these two candidates were distinct in one important way, at least for today, which is that Barry Goldwater, based on principle, voted against the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So you all may not be surprised that many Black Americans actually thought, well, goodness, here's LBJ, I think helping build upon, trying to usher in the civil rights bill that Kennedy never had a chance to really push forward. So Kennedy gives the address in June of 1963. He's assassinated 5 months later in Dallas, Texas. LBJ assumes the presidency. And many people say he used his political capital. He used to be a Senate Majority Leader, okay? So he knew how to wheel and deal and make laws. And so the Civil Rights Act gets pushed forward. So there's more to it than that, but that's the gist of it, okay? So you have one party, that's the party of civil rights. Right? You could go into a restaurant through the front door, order a hamburger. Sutton's, any Sutton's people? I like Sutton's. I know it's not good for you, but I love a good burger and those chips, right? Instead of going through the back door, instead of being treated with a lack of dignity. Okay? So really more broadly, this idea of a public accommodation. So the point I want to make here is that you have LBJ, right? This Southerner, all of a sudden changing the identity of the Democratic Party, being that of white supremacy, and not really advocating for Black civil rights. If you go back to the 19th century in particular, FDR changed it a little bit, right? But now all of a sudden Democrats are the party of civil rights and the Republicans are not. And so when many Blacks registered to vote, let me bring you back to rational, the relative advantage theory, they registered as Democrats. And so what happened with that is that the Democratic Party, instead of being under the control of moderate and conservative whites in the South, now all of a sudden you have Blacks that are registering. They're shaping the platform and they're advocating for different policies, in particular more progressive policies in the realm of civil rights and maybe even perhaps fiscal policy. Government should play a bigger role in people's lives. Government should make an effort to guarantee people's jobs, to guarantee people health care. Okay? And so it was rational for a moderate or conservative white person to see this influx, to see the Democratic Party no longer being what they thought, no longer being what it used to be, to look around and say, okay, I've got to find a new home. Okay, so that's the control part. And just to remind you, the Voting Rights Act is key because the voting rights is what allowed Blacks to register and then change what the Democratic Party represented in the South. Okay. The other piece is viability. And the idea there is what we also had happening at the same time is that there were more and more party organizations being created. So at the local level in particular, there were more and more Republican parties being created. So the Republican Party was increasingly competing for seats, right? Running for the state legislature, for example. And so because of that, they actually were winning as well. it wasn't unheard of prior to that. Well, for many decades in the 20th century, there'd be no Republican candidate at all, for Democrats to simply run unopposed. People would often joke you could fit all the Republicans in a phone booth because there were so few in number. Okay, so the combination of losing control of the Democratic Party due to the Voting Rights Act, okay, along with an increasingly viable Republican Party, led to a subset of whites, and key here, subset. I want you all to hear that because I know the Q&A is coming, okay? Not everybody, but a subset to move away from the Democratic Party and align with the Republican Party. Now, there's one other piece I'm going to add here. This is going to be Clark's or Chris's amendment, okay? So if Hood, Kidd, and Morris were in the room, they might have some words with me, all right? But I do think that this is a key part to the argument that I want to add for you all today, okay? Those two things I think are true. I totally buy the argument. But what also had to happen is that the Republican Party had to welcome with open arms these moderate and conservative, in many ways racially. See, I kind of slipped there. Racially conservative. I think that's a euphemism for a racist. I just had to put it out there. I just had to put it out there. We can come back to that later if you all would like me to. But what is a racial? What do you mean racially conservative? That sounds like anyway. So they had to welcome them with open arms. So let me just go back a little bit more. I'm not a historian, but these are things I engage with because of what I do. And I just taught the class, as I said. I'm always reminded about the fact that Little Rock 9, okay, and Eisenhower sending troops to help integrate, Central High School, okay. And there used to be liberal Republicans, right? There were no Rockefeller Republicans. But in large part, and I'll just kind of, throw this out there, we can come back to it later, in large part because of the Southern strategy of Nixon, which was driven in part by George Wallace winning multiple states in 1968, the Republican Party, instead of being a party that actually continued to advocate for Black civil rights, right, essentially welcomed with open arms the subset of racially conservative, right, and moderate whites. It didn't have to do that. That's not the road it had to go down, but it chose to. Okay, so let me kind of finish the point I want to make here, which is, in many ways, what Hood, Kidd, and Morris argue is that because of the Voting Rights Act, the South is what it is today. All right, it went from being solidly Democratic after the Civil War and Reconstruction, and people really not having very happy feelings toward the Republican Party, to now a region where Republicans, so I think North Carolina may be the only state with a Democratic governor out of the former 11. Feel free to fact check me on any of that. Not that I have to tell you all. I know in this audience, y'all going to hold me to account. So double check, okay? But I think Cooper's the only one right now. Well, many senators are also Republican, right? Where state legislatures are dominated by Republicans. It's due in part to actually the VRA. You can actually trace it all the way back to the VRA and how it shifted politics in the region. Okay, so that's one thing I want to kind of emphasize here. Just a couple of counter arguments out there, and this is where I'm going to be an egghead political scientist for a moment. So I hope I don't put you all to sleep just yet. Okay, what I find convincing about their argument is that when they account for other explanations, things like in-migration, which I'll talk about briefly, and things like class changes. It turns out that their measure of Black voter registration, of Black mobilization, is a consistent and a strong predictor of the Republican Party becoming successful from the mid-1960s until about 2008. In migration, the way you can think about that, and we're seeing this more and more, folks moving from the Northeast or moving from outside of North Carolina. And the way the argument goes is when these folks move in, the people who move in are more Republican than the folks who are here. And so as a result, it leads to different areas becoming more Republican. So it's a function of who's moving to an area. Excuse me. And they show that in some cases that bears out, but Black mobilization is consistently a better and stronger explanation for Republican success. Okay. And then one other idea out there is class. So the South went from being primarily agricultural or agrarian, okay, into moving more towards that changed, right? Industry came here, a lot of things shifted. And so for some folks at least, the more money they make, the more of that money they want to hold on to. And so they vote for the Republican Party. So they go right from a fiscal perspective, all right, their values are better represented by the GOP. And there's some evidence that class drives some partisanship, but again, it's not as consistent as this Black registration, this Black mobilization, which again is directly tied to the VRA. Okay, one last thing I want to say, and it picks up a little bit Dr. Hildebrand's point here about President Obama, is that we would not have the number of Black elected officials in this country, let alone the South, if it weren't for the Voting Rights Act. So some of my own research actually looks at the link between like the presence of Black people and the election of Black elected officials. And so I don't want to just sit here and cite you my research, but I've done work in that realm. I'm happy to say more if you'd like me to. But the long and short of it is that the most consistent and the most powerful predictor of whether or not a Black person will represent a congressional district or state house district or state senate district, it's a percentage of Black people in that particular jurisdiction. Now you might think, well, I mean, really? Like, Christian, you 640 on a Tuesday? You're telling me that? Like, I knew that already. I hope that's not your response, but the data bear that out. And so again, from a quantitative perspective, it's not just my opinion, not just what I think. If you crunch the numbers, if you take into account other potential explanations for that outcome, time and time again, the percent Black is the most consistent and the strongest predictor of whether or not whether or not a Black person represents a given area. All right. And so without Black voters, you don't get Black elected officials. 95%, 19 out of 20 Black people voted for Obama in 2008. 23% of whites. Now again, not 3. So I'm right. I think that's good. I mean, that's better than 3%. Right? If it's 3%, I probably will be saying it with a little bit of a different tone, right? But 43 and 95 are very different numbers. And so, without the support of Black voters, there is no Black president. Let me just, one other small thing before I hand the mic over. And also argue that without Jesse Jackson in '84 and '88, Shirley Chisholm, one of my favorite politicians of all time, in 1972, right? All of these folks are really key to helping pave the way for Barack Obama winning in 2008. So I hope some of that was interesting. Thank you all for your time. You want me to hand you the mic here, or do you? Okay. Here, I can't even put it back up.
All right, can you hear me? I guess I wanted to begin tonight by thanking y'all for coming, but this is the first I'm hearing about you retiring, Lloyd. So I just want to thank you for always being so thoughtful. Thank you for inviting me tonight. I know Carolina is going to be. I also want to say, Alex, I am so proud of you being over at the library. We need you there, and we have a great person in you, so I'm so excited. I'm very happy to sit alongside my new friend, Chris, and I want you to know that I'm getting the Rational Southerner. I'm a order that from Amazon because you convinced me with your time. And then, of course, finally, I want to say my parents are here tonight, Dave and Pat Mason. And of course, my wonderful husband, Corey. But I wanted to say, talk a little bit about Mom and Daddy, because when we were young, he was this big James Brown fan. Any of y'all ever heard of the Grateful Dead? So you know how people follow the Grateful Dead all over the country? We follow James Brown. And so wherever James Brown was in the area, we could drive or whatever it was, Daddy was there. That's how I feel about Reginald Hildebrand. Whenever I hear that Reg, tonight, I was like, oh, I get to hear. But anyway, Reg, thank you so much for bringing your perspective. And like you, Chris, I decided that I was not going to prepare anything formal, just to listen to what y'all had to say and respond. And I've been thinking so much about a continuum. As Alex shared with you, I've done a lot, maybe for the last 10 years, of work with the veterans of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And through the course of my work with them, decided not to call myself a local historian, which people also I'm not opposed to that. But I think the thing that's more appropriate for me is memory worker. And the reason that I call myself a memory worker is because the process that we've developed at Duke with the students, the veterans from SNCC, really made me see how there's such a huge misunderstanding about historical context, and how we as public oftentimes put history like on a shelf or as an individual kind of occurrence. And so my work with Cortland Cox, Cortland, who is the president of the SNCC Legacy Project and was one of the people who constructed the strategy for the SNCC in Mississippi when they were doing voting rights. Cortland said to me that we should think about the movement on a continuum. And that was very, very helpful to me. The veterans of SNCC also work with young people, and he told the young people, you should see yourself on the continuum. The movement was here before you got here. It'll be here after you leave. It's your job to contribute when you can and where you can. And that's really significant to me. And as I think about the things that Reg shared about the Reconstruction era, I have worked with young people called the James Cate Scholars, and that's one of the focus of our pursuits this summer is to really talk about Reconstruction, because I think that Reconstruction is a largely misunderstood era. There were so many very, very brilliant people who were really thinking about freedom. And you can't talk about the vote, in my view, without talking about freedom, because why do people want the vote? They want freedom. So the first things we did after we were emancipated, because of all these brilliant minds thinking together, some a lot Black, some white, working together, trying to wrestle with this notion of freedom, and in particular the vote. Because remember, prior to Reconstruction, because of the slave economy, there were a lot more Black people in the South. And even here in Chapel Hill, Black people were 48% of the population. Up until maybe about, I would say, about the early 1900s, Black people represented 48% of the population. So as a memory worker, it causes me to think about, so what were the implications of the ending of the enslavement to this whole new group of Black voters? And we talked about being, I don't like to talk about necessarily, Dixiecrats, Democrats, Republicans, and Black Republicans. Because for me, it really a lot of times, oftentimes go towards people who were tended on to be more racially conservative, as you said, Chris, and people who were willing to engage freedom. So these young Black people were thinking about freedom in a lot of different ways. And even in Chapel Hill, you have the Craig family who purchased land that they used to work on while they were enslaved right over there near Carrboro Car Wash. And they were thinking about what was going to happen after they were free. So the first thing we did was build churches and register people to vote and set up education. So it was always about freedom. And so I think it's really important to talk about and contextualize the vote in that way, because young people have always been at the center of this change. And so I went and looked at some of the people who were part of the Congress in the South after enslavement. James T. Raper, he was 24 when he became Speaker of Mississippi State House. Richard Harvey Kane was 36 when he first pastored a church in Brooklyn. And he was asking during that time, he was saying, all we ask is equal laws, equal legislation, and equal rights. John Roy Lynch published his book. He is my favorite first-time memory worker because he was a representative. But he wrote this, he published this book called The Facts of Reconstruction. And he published it during the time right after he served. And he said, because narrative, and narrative is just as something I'm very interested in, narrative is so important. And we understand that the narrative end on the conservative end is a very powerful machine. So I'm going to write down my experiences and why it was important and why we did what we did. So in addition to the book that Chris recommended, I would recommend, you really want to understand the perspective of Reconstruction from the people who were there and were really thinking about this thing. I would actually really recommend you get The Facts of Reconstruction. So what I'm saying is, after Reconstruction, it was young people, it was about freedom. Then we had people in the 30s and the 40s My father was one of the members of the Chapel Hill 9 students from Lincoln High School who started the sit-in movement here in Chapel Hill. And that's a wonderful thing. And my grandfather, his father, was 22 when he came back from World War II. And that's really significant. I had the absolute pleasure of interviewing Andrew Young, Ambassador Young, last week. So Ambassador Young is 92. And I'm doing some oral histories for the Legal Defense Fund. And is there any questions I want to ask? I only have like a specific time, and the LDF wanted like specific questions. But I called Caitlin Cox, who I shared with you, was a member of SNCC. And I also Charlie Cobb. Charlie Cobb has written books, these nonviolent things, Never Get You Killed. He was the founding member of the National Black Journalists Association. He wrote for the National Geographic, and he was also one of the founding members of SNCC. And I said, Charlie and Cortland, I'm going to interview Andrew Young. What do you think I should talk with him about? And Cortland said, if you're going to talk to Andrew Young, I want you to talk about the Double V for Victory campaign in the 40s, because that campaign really kicked off a lot of the stuff that was going on in the civil rights movement. And I thought about the conversations that my grandpa had, two grandfathers in Chapel Hill who were World War II veterans. And I wondered what those talks of freedom were like in the household that my father grew up in, when people could not vote here, people could not have public accommodations here, and it was really rough for Black people in Chapel Hill. And I wonder how those conversations impacted my father, who did what he did in 1960. So prior to 1960, there were the 40s. And I was so excited about talking with Ambassador Young because he's about 10 years older than the SNCC folk. So he was working with the Black Baptists who were working for freedom and trying to galvanize the vote. But he was a little younger than them, and he was a little older than the SNCC folk. So I was very interested in seeing ways in which the vote resonated with him and how these two eras kind of connected with each other. And so then when I spoke with Charlie, Charlie said, I want you to talk with him about Septima Clark, because had it not been for Septima Clark, he was the person that introduced and brought Andrew Young into SELs. And I want you to talk with him about Dorothy Cotton, because Black women are often left out of this narrative when it comes to vote. I'm convinced that Ella Baker is one of the most brilliant strategists this country has ever seen, right? I'm also a big fan of Fannie Lou Hamer. So we know about the iconic Fannie Lou Hamer, but we don't necessarily think of Black women as strategists when it comes to the vote. And lastly, I'll say that I had the opportunity to be mentored by the late, great Bob Moses. And Bob Moses said that when he came to Mississippi in 1961, at the advisement of Ella Baker, she introduced him to a man named Omzi Moore. And Omzi Moore was the head of the local NAACP in Mississippi. It was all about relationships. So Bob Moses was this young student, and these students were fresh off of the sit-in movements in the 60s, and so they went down to Mississippi on their way to get training in other places, ready for some action. And Charlie and Bob also point me to the fact that the local residents said, "Do you see any Woolworth lunch counters around here?" All you see is fields. And this is where we need help, because in Mississippi, you had 4 registered Black voters. 4 during that time. And so SNCC knew that part of their work had to be connecting with the community to get the vote. Because what Omzi Moore said is, we don't need to be integrated at lunch counters. We need Black power. So we hear this call for Black power in 1961, 1962, and they weren't talking about the type of Black power that later would become synonymous with that term. They were talking about Black voting rights, because they were subject to the laws, but they had no control over being a part of them. I guess that's, hopefully we can talk about young people today in the tradition of the vote and the connection to freedom and wanting to obtain that freedom, and what have been the lessons that we have learned over these centuries and over these decades that have been come out through our music. Nina Simone, my parents are here. When she wrote Mississippi GD, she was talking about the disparate treatment, right? When Marvin Gaye was saying what's going on in the 1970s, that's what he was talking about. When I refused to put my name down on the Democratic Party in the 1980s because of what was going on in South Africa, I was connecting my vote to freedom. So hopefully we'll have a conversation about what that actually meant to these generations of people. But I do think it's really important to talk about young people in the vote and talk about submitting ourselves to these fresh, brilliant ideas of the young people and how we can have these intergenerational conversations to talk about the vote and the freedom. So that through line I think is very important. So I'll stop there so we can have a conversation.
All right. Thank you all for such wonderful comments and commentary. Looking at the time, I'm just going to go ahead and start us off with one question, and then I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the audience. One of the things that struck me when I was listening to all of your comments is something that Dr. Hildebrand said when he talked about the current state of politics and how it often tempts us into despair and inaction, right? And then when we started to hear from Dr. Clark, I started to think about all of the statistical data that kind of gives us a sense of what's actually happening in our political landscape, right? When we think about predictors for whether or not Black politicians are going to be elected, when we think about, like, for example, you said 43% of white voters voted for Obama, but 95% of Black voters, right? There's something, I think, very important there. But then also ending with Anita's comment, this idea that there's a misunderstanding of the historical context that's often lost. And also just the importance of talking about young people in the vote. So my question is, when we think about present conversations that we are having about voting, about politics, about our current political landscape, taking into account all of those points that I kind of extracted from your comments, what would you all say is the most important, some of the most important points that we need to be injecting into this conversation? I think a lot of times when we have conversations about politics, it tends to think about the personalities of the politicians and maybe some hot button issues, not necessarily substantive conversations about people voting in their best interest and really digging into the minutia and the issues that really impact their everyday lives. So thinking about everything that was said in this conversation, what do you all think is the most important point that we need to be having when we are having conversations about our current political landscape and informing especially younger voters about the importance of and the potential of the voting rights movement in this continuum in where we are now? Is that question?
I mean, I just finished talking, so
No, that's right. You did just finish. So I really appreciate that question, Alex. So I hope the answer. I don't want to pull one of those politician answers where I talk for 10 minutes and it's like I completely ignore what you said. I don't. That's all those debates, right? It's like, what's your position on this? And they talk for 10 minutes about something else. Something I think I try to tell students when I'm on campus or just whenever I talk to people. So it's always interesting. I'm at the park. So my kids are a little bigger now, but I used to take them to the park a lot. And, oh, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a faculty member, right? So, what do you teach? Political science. And I always say I have job security. That's sort of like my go-to line because whether someone is to the right, to the middle, or left, or apathetic, like, it's just my way to try to disarm them. Because it's challenging to study the stuff I study in terms of what we're talking about, right, in the last 10 years or so. Something I try to talk to try to tell, younger folks is I think, not just young people, but just in general is, I think there's a lot of cynicism that I pick up on, and I get it. I mean, when I realize a lot of my students, the first election they remember is the 2016 election cycle, my heart goes out to them, right? Because like I remember And I vaguely, no, I'm now I'm gonna date myself here, but I kind of remember the '92 election. So when the elder Bush, and he's got his watch and he's like trying to check the clock. They really, y'all know, y'all remember that. But come on, I know in this room of people, right? And Bill Clinton, how I feel your pain. He kind of had that moment at the town hall. I remember a little bit '96. I remember the 2000 election, that went on forever. But I remember '08, right? And I remember, being at the Iowa caucuses, and oh, it was so flipping cold. My goodness, it was. I mean, imagine Iowa in January. It's really cold, but right, Grant Park, and Obama's out there with his family, and like, oh my goodness, like there's a black president, like who, right? And the hope and the optimism, right? That was true in our country, and it seems like like a lifetime ago, right? So anyway, this is what I'm saying, Alex. I try to acknowledge the cynicism because I think it's there for a reason, right? When you see the duplicity, when you see the hypocrisy, right? When you see the nastiness, like I don't want to see two like senior citizens. Oh, I'm gonna get in trouble here now. Oh no, but okay, let me back up a bit here. Okay, if I want to see people fight who are of a certain generation, I'll either tune in to like professional wrestling, like I used to watch, or watch a movie. I'm not gonna watch politicians like duke it out. Okay, I try to save myself there. I hope I didn't dig too deep, but that's all to say. Like that debate between Biden and Trump was kind of scarring for me. I don't know about you all. That one debate from 4 years ago, where they called each other names and they just were going at each other. I'm like, these two 70-year-old men are just behaving like juveniles. Like it was embarrassing. Who wants to watch that? I'd rather watch reality TV, right? Or The Voice, or I don't know, like basketball. I mean, other things I'd rather do than engage in politics. Just to answer your question, what I try to tell people is that voting is powerful, right? That I like alliteration. I think this is a good room for that, right? And I think about the three-fifths compromise. I think about the fact that for so long, Black people were considered property. One of the things that I talk about in my class is, going from property to persons. Okay, so think about that as the 14th Amendment, to then Obama '08 as president. And so I don't know. I just find that to be helpful because things have changed, right? So I love James Brown. Oh my goodness, I love The Godfather. Right? Ain't nothing changed but the rent, right? I mean, I could. No, I'm not going to take over the mic. But I love The Godfather of Soul. Okay, right? You can have Watergate, give me some bucks, and I'll be straight. Right? I know all that stuff. Things do change, though. Right? That there's power, right, with the franchise. Get up, get into it, get involved. Right? Things can change. And yes, it's slow. Yes, there's always the backlash, which I'm curious what you all think about that. Right? I feel like we're in a period of that. But things can change. So that's what I try to tell people. I say, yes, because you can always call people out. You can always, see the hypocrisy or duplicity, and say it's not worth it. But at the end of the day, like, you do have an ability to make a difference. Voting, it can be powerful. So anyway, is that enough time? Somebody else can jump in here. You want the mic here? You want the mic? Yes.
Okay. Well, I agree with what you're saying, and this reminds me of a scripture in the Bible. Jesus was about to break something down that people didn't want to hear, and he said, "This is a hard saying. We can receive it." So I'm predicating what I'm about to say. This is a hard saying. It's on us. It's not on young people. I think instead of us telling young people what to do, we should listen to the things that young people are saying to us about why they are not engaged in this process. We're at a time now where people have more information ever in the course of history. And so to have young people see young black people see the vote being taken advantage of time after time after time again, particularly in the South where we have a large voting number, and then not have some of the needs addressed of this particular community. Young black people are not stupid. Young people, I just told you that the average age of some of these people have written the greatest legislation. My father's generation, the generation of the 60s, everybody says that the greatest generation was the World War II vets. I think it's the generation of the 60s because prior to 1965, this country was not a democracy. And it was young people's insistence that we bring democracy to this country. And when they tried to, I work with the SNCC folks, and they looked funny, and they had these little overalls on, and they were not respectable like the Black Baptists and the other people who had typically been in charge. And one thing Andrew Young did say to me is that there was almost a disdain for these young people because the voting rights strategy was largely legislated, and they really wanted to fight a lot of these fights through legislation. But here you have these young knuckleheads, and their whole thing was getting arrested, taking these good attorneys from the people who's supposed to be focusing on this. So, I understood that. But you have these generational divides. But these people were right. The young people were right. This slow progression has never been acceptable for young people. And it's not acceptable for young people now. And so I oftentimes feel that us as older folks want to tell young people the right course. And I think we should listen a lot more. Because if you think about just about anything good that has happened in this country when it comes to freedom and democracy, it has been because of young people. And I'll say something else, since some of y'all might be mad at me anyway. Some of us need to sit down and let young people take over the leadership. This is how you get young people engaged. This is how young people become understanding. And I also believe very, very deeply into intergenerational organizing. I not only work with the SNCC folks, I work with young people who have crafted strategies. I work with Nsé Ufot, who was the head of the New Georgia Project, who along with Stacey Abrams crafted the policy of turning Georgia to a blue state. Nsé had been doing that work since about 2014, 2015. And the New Georgia Project registered 485,000 Black voters. Young people are not apathetic. Young people are just not dumb. Young people are saying, we've invested a lot into this, and we have gotten little for it. And I think we need to hear that. And I think we need to sit down and talk about ways that we can engage. Because I think what's missing from that conversation is the piece of how power is connected to the vote. The SNCC folks got it when they did the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. How many people have heard about the MFDP in Atlantic City and what happened in Shear in 1964? And that was a movement of young people and people from low-wealth communities defining what the power of the vote was and challenging the status quo. And young people need to know that lesson. And young people won't know if we don't tell them, because they're not learning it in school. But this is one way that young people created power of their own, voting right power. And I think this is the story that we need to tell young people. It's not necessarily the lesser of two evils. It is, let's see how we can come together, craft our own strategy, and get these folks to really think about democracy in a different way. So I'm always team young people when it comes to this, because I think we do a lot of finger pointing and y'all should vote, y'all should vote. Meanwhile, young people can't get a house. They got all this debt, Some of the things that we were able to do and accomplish, they are not. And I just don't think young people are dumb. So I think young people have a lot to learn about power from older people, about how to obtain that power, how to work together with Black and white folk, coalition building. There's so much conversation to be had, but I don't think it's going to work if it's a condescending conversation. And I think there's a lot of things that we need to learn about the struggles of young people, submit to young people, and listen to what they have to say. And then, join Lloyd in retirement.
I just have a couple of quick comments. First, I'm delighted to listen to these young people talk about thinking about the significance of the Voting Rights Act. If that act had not been passed, the current election would not be close. Donald Trump would win by a landslide. Which brings to the point, and I agree particularly with everything that Anita said, but that point underscores that as difficult as it seems, voting actually does matter. And one of the things when you're listening to people talk about the people who inspired them, like Amelia Boynton and Rebecca Clark and others, first, they had respect for young people, wanted to engage them, not lecture to them like in the model of Ella Baker, but they also would not let them despair or become cynical. They made them understand that they might have to figure out how to make their influence felt, but their influence could be felt, and they were important, they mattered, somehow or another in ways that older people may not be able to see, but they were there to encourage, support, get them out of jail if they needed to, but never let them think that you can back out of this or be standing on the sides. That ultimately this is your struggle, and that's. And the other concern, and I told you the story of Pharaoh Glass, got that in your head. It's hard to think that if he were around, he would just say, I get all that, but I kind of dealt with worse. And I died for these problems. And at this point, let's buck it up and do something. This is not a point to talk about how difficult things are, given what we went through, hoping that you would have the opportunity to do more than I could. There's a danger, Anita, in not sounding, as I probably just did, like I'm spouting platitudes about things that I may not really understand what their issues are. What I am suggesting is, without sounding like that, that there is a mandate, there is a call to order, there is a recognition just how horrible things are, and that the engine to move out of this will not be found in my generation, but it must be found in yours. And your job isn't tell us how bad things are. We know that. To figure out how to move beyond where we are to get us where, as the next generation did. And the last concern I have is the matter of class. That when we're talking about political engagement, and when pollsters make the distinction between college educated and non-college educated, it sounds like they're talking about smart people and ignorant people. They're actually talking about people who are doing fairly well in the economy and people who are not. And they have an agenda that is legitimate. And they are engaging the world that is in a way that is different than if I go out from my front porch in my house at 3 o'clock in the morning, nothing is going to happen to me. If I'm living somewhere where I'm concerned about my safety or my child's safety, or about the drug dealer who may come, or how the police might deal with me, they've got a whole agenda that is urgent. And I'm looking for someone to address that, or to help me figure out how to address that, to empower me to do that. And too often, I think, people with backgrounds like mine tend to see the political world, the things that are most important to me, that most affect my safety, that most help me feel that I'm on the right side of whatever I'm thinking of or about to get for that moment. And I made a point of going, there is a coalition for an Hidden Island, Durham, that holds vigils whenever a young person is shot. And going to those things and listening to concerns of people who came out to memorialize people, none of them almost college educated, all struggling. No one was talking to them when responding to their needs. That's a huge resource is the wrong word, but there is energy there. There are concerns there. There are issues there. But as Danita is saying, when listened to, they have to be respected. They have to be empowered and put assisted in finding positions of leadership to carry that forward. When
Well, can I just hook on what you said, Reg, just because y'all, for me, it's Reginald, Hildebrand, and Freddie Parker. I love Freddie Parker too. But I have to say that your words resonated with me so much, and I want to bring you a gift. At least it was a gift to me because it's hard in these organizing streets sometimes, and it gets really difficult and it gets dark. And so we conducted some oral histories. I think it was either earlier this year. That's modest anyway. It was either earlier this year. Hey, Madison was a part of the SNCC Digital Gateway, and so yeah, y'all can clap from that. She's dope. Well, we were doing interviews. We were doing interviews, and so there was one that was a gift to me, and it's with Cortland Cox, and he actually was interviewing Nsé Ufot, who I spoke with earlier, and Charles Taylor from Mississippi. Charles Taylor is the state director of the NAACP in Mississippi. So Nsé and Charles were younger, and Cortland. So Nsé and Charles go on and on. They were talking about how difficult it is to have a supermajority because she's from Georgia, he's from Mississippi. It's like, it's really hard to deal with these legislatures and stuff like that. You got all these supermajorities. And Cortland, who was holding down the fort, was listening so diligently, and in the way that Cortland is so wise, he said, I hear you. It is dark. And Nsé was saying, it's really dark right now. It's real dark. And you can understand how young people might get a little discouraged right now in the moment that we're in. And Cortland said, and this is the gift. He said, yeah, but I want you to think about something. When we were organizing, we had a supermajority and Black people couldn't vote. We couldn't vote, and we won. So after that conversation that was so good and enlightening, Nsé said to me, she said to them, she said, after our conversation, I acknowledge that it is dark, but we are at the end of the throes of white supremacy. And anything that's about to die fights real hard before they die. And she said, so it is dark, but it's not midnight dark. It's 3 a.m. dark. So ever since we had that conversation, I was making mugs and everything. It's such a gift to those of us who are discouraged and those of us who don't think that our vote means anything. I think that we should use this opportunity to plan when the sun rises. And that's how I've been trying to direct my work, not thinking about how bleak it is, but thinking about how we're going to do when that sun rises up and work together to make sure that it's a good day. So anyway, that's a gift to me. I'm putting it to you, and it was based off of what you said, Reg. So thank you.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the audience for questions.
So I'm going to circulate with the microphone. We're going to get questions. I want to thank Paul Benici because we are live streaming this, and there are some 30 people online, so we may get a question. We have a good question. Should we start with one question?
Start here, and then we can.
And then we're going to go around the room. We want you to know out there in radio, TV land that you're part of this conversation. We have a lot of teachers. What's the question?
Miss Jerma Jackson asks, as I listen to your responses, it seems that intergenerational conversations are solely needed to carry the legacy of the VRA. How can we facilitate those conversations in this moment?
You want to follow up on that? Anyone? How can we facilitate intergenerational conversation?
Well, I can tell you that I work with the women of the movement who are women in Chapel Hill who were very involved in the civil rights movement. I also work with the Alumni Association and movement veterans, local movement veterans who were very influential in the movement. But at the same time, put them in conversations with the young people that I work with, James Cate scholars, and make sure that they have an understanding between these generations of how Chapel Hill was during that time, and also give them a contextual perspective of that work. So in addition to the conversations that we have with them, we also partner with anybody who's working with young people and try to foster those conversations. And I agree with you, those conversations are critical and they are lovely. We just, we don't know each other through generations. But when you see young people and older people sit down and really talk about issues on a level of respect, you should see how much love and understanding there is in that room. But also, and I won't put too much out there, but I have seen some of the strategies that young people are using today on a national level be informed by some of the conversations they're having with SNCC folks. So we can have them in the libraries, we can have them at churches, we can have them at schools, we can have them wherever. But I do think that those things are very important. So thank you for that question. And I absolutely agree that we need to be creative when we talk, just when we take these conversations. Started your donor thing.
Okay, I'm going to come over here. Is that right?
So I actually am going to speak. I'm sorry. My name is Madison. I'm speaking before my friend Felton. And I just wanted to add on to what Danita was saying. These intergenerational conversations can actually be found on YouTube now. One of the intergenerational conversations that Danita actually talked about between Cortland Cox, Charles Taylor, Hinsey Wolfoot is actually on YouTube. And all you have to do is search MHI movement on YouTube and you can find those conversations. But here's the question.
Hello, my name is Felton Fouché. It was nice talking to you the other day, Mr. Mason.
Good to see you, Brother
Good
Felton.
to see you as well. I wanted to ask 2 questions, maybe 5, but I'm going to try to keep it short. For one, can you guys maybe speak to what a lack of specificity in regards to what Black Americans have endured in this country has become when there's a broad brush now utilized to paint what Blackness is? I think that's a disruption, and there's been a lot of acronyms and things that in place that kind of disrupt the specificity of the people who were most affected and continue to be most affected in society in a negative way. And the easy one, I think, is I think about in 1963 when Malcolm X made a comment about what other group is represented by entertainers and actors and performers and comedians. And we are still there as far as the Democratic Party goes. And it's a big disappointment. And I think it is a big problem that is presented in the reasons why so many people are disengaged, so many Black Americans are disengaged, because you can get Cardi B and some of these other entertainers, and I'm not trying to, I think it was just 50 Cent you and I were talking about. Get to this Capitol Hill, get all of this access and be so-called representatives of the Black community, but we don't have any academics or intellectuals or anybody up there that's really talking about things specific to what we need here. So that goes back to what are we voting for? So your vote is to be earned, not expected, and that needs to be back on the table. Thank you.
Someone want to respond? Go ahead.
I really appreciate that. So because my line of work, I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And so I need to read this guy's work carefully, but you might find it interesting. This guy, Julian Womble, is a young social scientist, and he looks at Black politicians, and it really actually makes me kind of revisit some of my own ideas about representation. But the point I want to share with you is the idea of how committed is the politician to the Black community. And he shows that, like, in variation to that really makes a big difference in terms of how Blacks respond to a given politician. So in other words, instead of just assuming, as long as someone has the right face, right, that all of a sudden people will Blacks will just vote for anyone because of their shared racial identity. He shows that's not the case, right? It's really about how committed you are to uplifting the broader Black community. I wish I could give a great answer to your question, but more I want to acknowledge, I appreciate what you're saying. Something I've been thinking more about is, I went to an event the law school put on affirmative action. There's this outstanding lawyer, I'm forgetting his name, but he talked about this idea of ascendant Black people. So let me get to the point instead of just rambling off of them. So what I hear you saying is that, right, there's a certain groups of folks, and not that we're trying to play the oppression Olympics, right, but people who are descendants of enslaved people continue to face lots of discrimination in the United States, right? And so, I mean, my kids themselves are multiracial, right? And so, like, I think about them, and I'm an academic, and my spouse is a mental health professional, and then how they're going to experience being women of color is going to be different from how my sisters and I grew up, because both of our parents are Black Americans and grew up have parents from the Deep South. Right? Since I did ascendant Blacks, so the increase in multiracial people who have Black ancestry, right? Blacks who are Latino, right? And so again, it's a different experience. And I'm forgetting, there's another group I'm forgetting right now off the top of my head. It'll come to me a little later. Are Black immigrants, right? And so what I hear you saying is a lot of times people just say, Black and not recognize one, Blacks are very sophisticated in politics, right? How committed are you to uplifting the community is something that people think about. And when that's not the case, you're not going to have people's wholesale support, right? Blacks are very sophisticated politically. They aren't naive. And then also there's lots of differences, within the Black community, some tied to what I was talking about, but actually, given some of what we were talking about earlier, the term intersectionality comes to mind. Again, I'm not just trying to throw words out there, right? But you mentioned class. And so, right, someone who's lower class and Black is going to have maybe a different experience, right? And maybe a different set of preferences than someone who's upper class or someone who's middle class. Gender. So I really appreciate your point. Need about Black women being rendered to the sidelines, right? And so there's all these other identities, right, that influence how people experience the world. And what ends up happening is that those who maybe have more privilege within a racial group end up getting more access. So the entertainers, the athletes, where versus the person on the street who really is. I go to Aldi. I love Aldi, by the way, right? It's more affordable than Harris Teeter. I'm not making that kind of money yet. You have the keywords yet. At some point, give me 15 years, right? But right, you go to all, it's like, man, the eggs are expensive, right? Dang, milk is high. People who really are affected by those things, right? Who need gainful employment. You want to see them have a seat at the table. But anyway, I hope I addressed some of what you're getting at. But I appreciate your point. I think Blacks are a lot more sophisticated than people realize. I find it insulting when someone thinks all you have to do is have a Black politician who also walk across stage. I'm not going to name any names here, but right, everyone's going to vote for them. That's not how it works. And then the intersectionality, I think about respectability politics, some of what you were saying, like Fannie Lou Hamer and others have to deal with. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So thanks for your comment. I don't know if anyone. So
I hope quick comments. I'm not. Your concern brings to mind, and I may not be addressing specifically what you mentioned, but it did raise, in my mind, the definition of what constitutes the Black community. It's not what it was when I grew up. My next door neighbors are from Nigeria, and the range of peoples and cultures and languages that are now part of what we are defining and redefining and trying to engage as the Black community means that, Zanita, the generation that grew up with that as the norm are going to have to come up with the cultural apparatus and the leadership institutions that will encompass effectively who we are now, who is not who we were when I was growing up. So my trying to say, we should rely on Black preachers in the church is not really going to cut it when you look at the rise of the Muslim population in the Black community. There are a whole number of issues and elements that are part of the mosaic of who we are now that has to be part of what we think about when we are talking about leadership. You may have been addressing more specifically the issue about people who have inherited the negative legacies of chattel slavery in the United States and the segregation that followed. And if that is what you were saying, I hear that loud and clear, that can't be lost in what I just said, that those things are still very important and have to be addressed directly and specifically, and not saying, so one size fits all for Black people, that it doesn't matter who you hire to fit the affirmative action slot, whether they are from Nigeria or Jamaica or from Brooklyn. Actually, it does matter. in terms of what problem you're trying to solve or what injustice you are trying to address. It makes a difference. Doesn't mean those other things aren't important. They have to be part of our the way we view things. But it's complicated. The best, and on the question about who gets to speak and what is heard, one of, if not the best talk I ever heard was by Harry Belafonte when he was speaking on Martin Luther King Day at Duke. And he was reflecting on his life in the arts and in politics, and how growing up in the 50s in New York, in order to be good at his craft as a singer and as an actor, he had to delve deeply into the culture and the issues of his time. And he contrasted this, and part of this is just, the nostalgia of an old man. I know that, but I think there was something to it. He also said, when the problem that we're facing now, primarily in terms of the difference in the culture and how it affects leadership and what is said and how the culture works. He said the problem with the culture isn't that it's racist, sexist, or violent. It is all of those things. He said the overarching problem is that it's shallow, that it doesn't allow you to think deeply about anything. It encourages you, in fact, to be shallow, to be flashy, to be a commodity of one sort or another. And you're pushing something, your website or your podcast or whatever it is. And if you do that successfully, then you have the credibility to go before Congress. Have no idea how, the boys would make out with the social media climate that we have now. If you're going to develop that kind of argument that many of us were in awe of and had to spend time to grasp, can't grasp it in a few minutes. People are gone. And Ella Baker as well, those long meetings that they had at SNCC, you needed patience and had to listen. And so part of the problem of why people become spokespersons who we think don't quite have the depth that we would like is because the culture supports that, encourages that, almost makes that inevitable.
I'd also like to offer, Brother Felton is part of a history group that we have in Orange County, headed up by Freddie Parker, and I wanted to mention that because that's another group of intergenerational conversations that we have. And Brother Felton is a wonderful historian who is a part of that group. I want to kind of connect some of the things that we've been talking about in class to what you were, question that you were also talking about. I do think at the core of whatever I do, relationship building is at the core of whatever I do. I do think there's so many things that we can conveniently misunderstand. And because narrative is so important, we have to think about how our thoughts and understandings are informed. So here in Chapel Hill, I think we're at about a 28% proficiency rate for Black students in Chapel Hill, college proficiency rate. So if 72, I think I'm not good with math. So I think if 72% of our children aren't deemed to be college proficient, and we're only having conversations with people who have advanced degrees, and these are the folks who are purporting to speak for Black people, I have to ask, how is your discourse being informed? And we're at maybe about 2 generations solid where Black people have had an opportunity to go to college en masse. And we're not doing the critical conversations. We're not having those critical conversations that we need to have with each other in order to really understand and inform policy. So oftentimes I think that we revert to narrative, that we revert to stereotypes, we revert to what we think we understand about each other, and that is problematic. And now it has become problematic, to be honest, with the diaspora. As someone who proudly acknowledges our African heritage, our story here in America is unique. Our culture here as Black Americans is unique. I joke with my white friends, don't get upset, but I say, don't none of y'all call me tomorrow, because tomorrow is Juneteenth. And that's the one holiday that really acknowledges our footprint, our labor footprint in this country and what we have been through in this country as Black Americans. And I think that's really, really important, not only in terms of what that has meant for us to be able to obtain health care, housing, and just how systemic oppression has informed our abilities to move ahead, from everything from that to education, but also how what that has meant to freedom and the ideas that we have espoused in terms of freedom. And so what that often has meant is that Black Americans were the foundation for fighting for freedom, for Latinos, for Asian folks, for right now, you have young people fighting for Palestinians. It has always been Black folk who understood oppression because of what we have been through and have fought for other folk. And if you go, I'm a proud graduate of the North Carolina A&T State University. And what I can share now is that the last statistic I saw is that the descendants of enslaved make up a smaller minority of college students that were from folk from the continent. There was a whole influx of immigration laws that were relaxed in the later part of the 80s, much due to the freedom struggle, much due to us as Black Americans making gains. And what has happened is we have fallen behind. So we got to talk. We have to have conversations. We have to talk about what that means. And at the same time, I am not of the opinion that we need to distance ourselves from people from the continent, because while we suffered under Jim Crow, we see manifestations of colonialism. And so if you are an immigrant coming to this country, it's very easy to buy in some of the narratives that have been put here before you got here. The one that I am most perplexed by is that Black people are lazy. I think if we call anything else, we should not be called lazy. But if you don't know any Black Americans and you heard this, then I understand how that discourse could be challenged in that way. So I just wanted to offer that. I wanted to offer that. And I also wanted to say, when it comes to, and I agree with Malcolm X, Black folk are the only people to call in entertainers to ask them, you know how hard Reginald, Hildebrand, and Chris Clark had to work to get their PhDs. And so, these are folks who had to really work hard and really understand the complexities of these situations, Alex. So to have entertainers who are really informed by a lot of narrative that they heard, we have a lot of opinions. We need informed opinions. And in order to have informed opinions, really talk about what we need in this country, we got to be serious about who we ask the questions. So that's my answer, Pete.
I have another question here or comment, then I'll come back over there. And thank you for bringing up Juneteenth. This is our Juneteenth celebration right here at the Chapel Hill Public Library.
Thank you. And thank you to the panelists and moderators for this very rich conversation. My name is James Williams, and I want to lift up a couple of people that we're talking about voting rights and the Voting Rights Act, and we should not leave this room without there being some reference to James
Please start making your final selection.
Good going, Griff.
The set, the library, the meeting room, the restroom. One library will be closing in a minute.
Stay open.
In the Black community,
Okay.
we say you ain't got to go home. You gotta get out.
You gotta get out of here. Yeah. So James R. Walker Jr., who was one of the first 4 Black students enrolled at UNC in 1951 at the law school. He was one of the first 2 to graduate. He's from northeastern North Carolina, as am I. He's from Ahoskie. After he finished law school a few years later, in 52 and 56, he went back to northeastern North Carolina. And I can't think of a single person in this state who did more to help to try to ensure voting rights for Black people than James R. Walker. He litigated cases. He formed grassroots organizations. And this is in northeastern North Carolina. It's a different place than Chapel Hill and Durham and Carrboro and Greensboro. Very rich, deep Klan tradition. You put your life on the line when you were doing what James R. Walker did. And so I did want to lift him up. And then Sarah Smalls. You're talking about women and the movement. Sarah Smalls was in charge of the civil rights movement in Williamston, North Carolina, which is also northeastern North Carolina. But not only that, in 1965, she ran for U.S. Congress. I'm told that she was the first Black person to run for Congress in the state of North Carolina since I'm forgetting his name, George White. Yes, but nobody knows this. I think that's a powerful thing. That she had the courage, she had the tenacity. She put together, I think Floyd McKissick and Gordon Franks were her campaign managers. Northeastern North Carolina. So when we think about these rights and challenges, in addition to thinking gender and class and race, we need to think region too, because there's a lot of variation there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
James. All right. We're going to take our one last question. We already got our eviction notice, so
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to try to keep this short as we have an expected departure very soon. My name is Beverly Boone. For the past 2 years, my field has been an adjunct instructor of history here in North Carolina. So before that, for almost 30 years, I've lived as a Black woman in America. So I'll just go from that. My main concern is in teaching African American history, I feel as if some do not understand how traumatizing that could be. So what are we doing to really nurture and care for the identities that are being affected, and not just our Black youth, but youths of other ethnic groups also? It is very difficult for me to go through the chapter of slavery one week, and then maybe 6 weeks down the road, I'm talking about politics, and my students are saying, how can we believe a country that's founded off of the backs of slaves? Like, to be real, I don't know. I have no idea. I can only tell them what's in the textbook, but I also tell them my own personal opinions. And I say, you really have to try to carve that out for yourself. But what can we as professionals and as citizens do to help cultivate their identity, to help them feel empowered and to not leave feeling depressed and oppressed, especially because some of our youth really don't know the full truth of what we've been taught. For so long, African American history has been popcorn. We get Black History Month. That's it. And we go through racism every day. We go through prejudice every day. We live with family members who have PTSD. What are we doing to make effective change in ways that we can see? Because so much can be helped. So what can we do to help heal these identities, to help nurture these identities and how they think about themselves, but also how they can show up in the workspace? Okay, how they can increase in the classrooms. What are we not doing and what can we do different? That's my question. Thank you so much.
So maybe we have answers from the community as well. And I'll come back here. This is a conversation.
I'm another Beverly. I'm Beverly Falls, and I'm in Durham. And what you're saying about the young people, that's exactly what I was sitting here focusing on. Because to the oppressor, no form of protest is acceptable. And I think about, they mentioned the ERA and suffrages. Susan B. Anthony wanted to get white women the right to vote, not Black women the right to vote. But Alice Paul came in and did it a different way. Bayard Rustin got arrested in Chapel Hill during a freedom ride in the 1940s and made them get rid of chain gangs in North Carolina. The youth that went to the Woolworths in Greensboro, they were peers of Emmett Till. And the people like Maxwell Frost, that's now in Congress, they are the survivors of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in Florida. And the Sandy Hook children would have graduated this year. So we, in telling the history, need to also tell them that the kids that were in Birmingham getting hosed by the fire hoses and bitten by the dogs and beaten and arrested by the police, those were children. Those were not grown-ups. And they have power, and they're going to change the world.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond to? Yeah.
I will,
Yeah.
because my my dad's in the room. When I was, we need community. We need community. I said, and I guess I will always make this part of my talking point. My daughter, who is 22 years old, was lamenting on how hard she had, and I'm like, this kid is tripping. She never had to worry about anything to eat, or she had like the best of everything. She didn't go through any. And one time she said, I said, Akanke, at least you weren't enslaved. You can suck it up, But the truth of the matter was, it was me and my ignorance. And then when I would have oral interviews with my elders, they would say, we were poor, but we didn't know it. And that sounded equally ludicrous to me. I'm like, how y'all? Didn't you say you got apple for Christmas? We got bikes and stuff. Y'all were poor, right? You have one pair of shoes. Y'all were poor. Y'all were poor. I don't know how you didn't know it. But the truth of the matter is, material things are not wealth. And what elders were talking about they had that was worth everything was community. Community is what got us through enslavement. Because no matter what you had to go through, you had people who cared about you, who nurtured you, who had skills to build a house for you if you needed to, give you some good old cooked food. You had cousins to play with. So you knew that you were loved and you were valued by your community, even if you weren't on the outside. And because we have been chasing wealth, in my opinion, that has led us to places that are outside of the community where our families originated. And I hate that my kids didn't grow up with their cousins. I hate that, because a cousin is somebody you can talk to and confide in. And so I believe what Reg said was so smart and so wise. Our communities look different than they did when I was coming up and when he was coming up. But those structures in ways of building community with people that have the same values, are working towards the same goals, and understand how to be with each other are critical, in my view. So understanding, contextualizing, and dealing with the trauma that comes with having to explain these very difficult conversations. I never lie to my children. The time that I cried hardest is when I had to explain to my 5-year-old son why people would put other people in bondage because they were different. And I revisit that trauma every time I read about some of the atrocities that happened right here in Chapel Hill. It's a little personal for me. But Julian Carr talking about whipping somebody to their skirts fell off. I'm wondering if that was a lady who was related to me. So it's like there is trauma that comes, but it's so critical that we soften that blow by having a good set of folks that you can depend on, rely on, and ride with. That's what'll get us through. And that's what I
Alex, I know we're about, I feel like there's one more question and then can you wrap it up after that?
Absolutely.
I know this question has been,
Well, it's not a question. Okay. While we're here celebrating the Voting Rights Act, I hate to put a damper on things, but the VRA is near life support. Okay. Starting in 2013, our Supreme Court has negated Section 5 of that act. And luckily, they may be working on other parts of it. Okay, Section 5 required any state in the South that modified their voting rights privileges had to be approved by the Justice Department. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, that's not needed anymore. Luckily, we still have Section 2 of that act, which has been used this year to help change gerrymandering in Alabama back to something reasonable. But you should realize the VRA is fighting for its life right now.
is that where we wanted to end the conversation? Alex, thank you for that. We're hanging by a thread.
Oh, the whole energy. It was 3 a.m. Thank you for
So
I'll bring us back up a little bit just by thanking our panelists, if we can give them a round of applause. Thank you to the audience for all of your questions. I think that all of us have definitely heard something from those on the stage that we can take with us and think about as we continue to think about political engagement, we continue to think about communities and all of the ways that we can continue to do what Danita hinted at, which is building community and providing, really building up that soft place to land in the midst of all of the conversations that we are having that sometimes can seem to be very daunting and discouraging. So thank you all for giving us some things to think about. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our audience who joined us online. And thank you to Lloyd. And this is probably going to be one of your last events before you retire, but I'm sure that you're going to...
I'm on life support system too. And I want to thank Molly, Luby, and the entire team here at the library. And I want to thank Alex for leading us, and my friends Reg and Chris and Danita. I can't think of a more talented group to share their stories and their perspectives. And all of you, I only have one final piece of advice. Vote early. Can I say vote often? Get out there and vote. It still matters, I think. Have a great evening, and thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you so much.